Hello and welcome to Miniature Adventures. I'm Big Lee, and today I wanted to discuss the barriers to entry for young wargamers. So the grain of the hobby is something that often comes up in blog posts and videos and in pretty much every conversation you have at a show. We're obsessed with the grain of the hobby, and quite rightly so, because we want to make sure that our great hobby goes on and has an afterlife long after we're gone. And I think the problem is us old grognards have a load of really good theories about why the hobby is grey and why young people don't want to join the hobby. But actually, our theories aren't important. It's what they actually think that I think is important. So with that in mind, I had a conversation with my two kids. Now, I say kids, my eldest daughter's in her mid-20s, but they've both grown up in a house where gaming was very prevalent. They've both wargamed and they've both played other types of games. And so I thought I'd have a chat with them about why, or what are the barriers that they think that young people would encounter. What would put young people off of taking up wargaming? So as I just mentioned, both my girls have played war games with me before. They didn't have a lot of choice sometimes. And both of them have managed to beat me, which again shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone that knows me. But we've also played other types of game. I introduced them to role-playing games, and we played lots of board games, all sorts of things like that. Now, both of my daughters have gone on to be more interested in role-playing games, which is where I started, so I haven't got a problem with that. As far as I'm concerned, that's a victory. And they both run their own gaming groups, written their own stories, organised their own games. So I'm proud as punch about it, because I've made them into gamers. Now they're not, neither of them are particularly keen on picking up the brush and painting huge armies for the table, but they have in the past, as younglings, joined me around the games table and then thrashed me to teach me a lesson. So while they're not wargamers, they are gamers, and I'm quite happy with that outcome. But I thought it would be interesting to speak to the pair of them and try and find out what it is that's putting them off of going into wargaming. Now, in no particular order, I'm going to start off with the one that both of them mentioned, was that sometimes the rules can seem too complicated. Now, partly that's down to presentation. Perhaps I'm not a great teacher, so I'll let that one slide. But I do know what they mean. Some of the bigger, more the larger rule sets can be quite intimidating. They seem to be heavily rule led. There's pages and pages of stuff for them to remember, and it's not as easy as, let's face it, a role-playing game. It's sitting around making up a story together, and yes, there's rule books and so on that go with playing games like D&D, for instance, but you pick it up as you go along, whereas with wargaming you need to know the rules to play the game, and so you need someone to show you, which I'll come back to in a second. But I do think that there's a point to be said there. There's a lot of very simple games that have been coming out. There's a push towards, or seems to me to be a push towards, smaller skirmish games, lighter sets of rules, and I think that's a good thing. You can still have the more complicated rule sets, and us old grognards can love all that, but I think you need simpler sets of rules, something that's easy and quick to get into, so that you can play games very quickly and without a load of tutoring in order to be able to play a game successfully. But something else that they mentioned that I thought was very interesting is they found it hard, or would find it hard to pick a period to play. And this goes to something I was listening to on a podcast recently, and I was discussing the fact that we need some historical movies, some big historical movies, to fire people up and inspire them. When we had the Lord of the Rings films out, and the next thing you had your Lord of the Rings game, and loads of people got into wargaming that way. Or you have a big Second World War blockbuster, and games like Flames of War and Bolt Action and so on become much more popular. And perhaps we need some big Hollywood busting movies to really inspire people and want them to get into a particular period. I mean, I'm a bit of a butterfly when it comes to my history, but I've also been around a long time and I know lots of little bits of history, and then I might go and focus on something there, or that'll catch me eye on, or go off and want to research that. And so, and obviously being immersed in the hobby, I know what sort of game periods are out there, what rule sets are available, what model ranges are available. But if you're young and you're new to the hobby, how do you pick? How do you choose? And it's probably one of the reasons why so many gamers, if they do get into historicals, it's almost always World War II. And there's nothing wrong with that. But obviously, how many 9-year-olds, for instance, go, "Oh, Dad, I really want to play Napoleonics." Then, having picked a period, I think the other thing that they mentioned is they feel that they need guidance to play the game, to know the rules, to understand what the hobby is about. And obviously a lot of that, I think, comes from having someone you can refer to, and in our case it's a family member. Having me drumming it into them. They knew what wargaming was, and they've been to shows with me, they've been played games with me, so they've had that. But for other people maybe outside of that sphere, if you like, if their parents aren't wargamers, how are they going to learn? Now obviously we want them to come to shows, and it's great to see more families and younger kids being brought to wargaming shows, and obviously the last couple of years have been very trying for shows, but I think one of the main things that is one of the main benefits of a wargaming show for the non-wargamer turning up is the ability to see loads of games, to be inspired, to be able to speak to people who are in the hobby, to find a local club, for instance, or somebody who's willing to help. So I think that the value of shows and the need for them to come back is essential for the future of the hobby. Now, having mentioned Games Workshop, it's also worth mentioning that there's an accessibility issue there. I think a lot of gamers, a lot of young gamers, come in via the Games Workshop route, playing science fiction or, like say Lord of the Rings or one of those types of games. But if they're not interested in sci-fi, or they're not interested in fantasy, how else are they going to see it? How many independent game shops are there on the high street? And I remember back in the day when I was first getting into role-playing games, for instance, there was lots of independent game shops doing a wide range of games, not just role-playing games, but war games and stuff like that. And a lot got bought up by these big chains and have gone by the by. And there's very few independent shops that you just stumble across in the high street. The shops that you are going to find are going to be model train shops, for instance. And they have pretty much a niche audience type feel to them, I think. So there is a question of accessibility there, and we need to make our hobby more accessible, more visible to more people, to try and draw them in. Which is where YouTube videos, for instance, come in, and why I advocate doing short format battle reports, because that short format is much more likely to be viewed by a younger person, and maybe inspire them to look a bit deeper and join the hobby, attend a show, for instance, because they're not going to necessarily stumble across that accessibility in the high street if they're not interested in science fiction. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not decrying science fiction and fantasy. I love it myself, but if that's not their particular interest, then you've lost them. And we don't want to lose anybody from the hobby. We want to be able to capture everybody and bring them in that may have any sort of interest in gaming. Another thing that both of them have mentioned, and this is a fair point here, not everyone wants to paint. It's a complete side hobby in its own right, and it does take years to master, and you need specialist equipment, and it's expensive. Maybe you just want to put pre-painted figures down on the table, and obviously, us Old Grognards, we're quite happy to go out and spend several £100 on a pre-painted army, or pay someone to do our painting for us. Not me, but people do. But that's not necessarily open to younger players who may be coming into the hobby for the first time. And the very idea that they've got to paint larger forces can put them off, which is one of the reasons why I think skirmish games are so popular, and so popular with younger players in particular, is because the commitment in terms of getting figures down on the table is a lot less. But even if you've got to paint only a few figures and you've never painted before, that can still be a barrier to entry. So definitely games where you've got pre-painted models as a part of the kit are always a great in, because it gets them into the game in the first place. But it's definitely a potential barrier, and this is where things like shows to show off what you can do and how easy it can be to paint, and clubs that have, you know, that can provide painting support to new players and new members of the club are so vitally important, I think, because otherwise, how else are you going to learn? I mean, okay, you and I are going to go on YouTube to learn a new technique or whatever, but it's not as easy to learn how to paint off of a YouTube video as it is when someone's sitting there tutoring you, talking you through the process, explaining to you the difference between this type of paint and that type of paint, or why you should use that sort of brush and so on. I think it's always better if you can do that teaching process in person. So what do you think? I mean, I've been able to talk to my two daughters and ask them their opinion, but have you had any feedback from perhaps younger members of clubs and so on about what might have be a barrier to them? Because understanding that will help us all to reduce those barriers for the next generation joining the hobby. So please join the conversation below or over on my blog, Big Lee's Miniature Adventures. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe and share. And if you want to get updates on my weekly videos, please hit the bell notification icon. So until next week, look after yourself, get in as many games as you can, and of course, keep rolling high.